The USDA just quietly revised its food price inflation forecast for the third time in 12 months. Not a small revision, a significant one. And when you start digging into why, when you actually pull the underlying data instead of reading the press release, what you find is not a temporary blip caused by bad weather or a one-time supply shock. What you find is a food delivery system that has been under structural pressure for years, finally starting to show the cracks in ways that are measurable, documented, and accelerating. I've been going through the producer price index reports, freight cost data, and the earnings transcripts from the major grocery conglomerates, and the picture they paint together is not the one you're getting from mainstream financial media. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what's happening to America's food supply chain, why it's been nearly invisible until now, and what it means for your household finances over the next 12 to 18 months. Let's get into it. Here's the first thing you need to understand. The price of food at the retail level, what you see on the shelf, is the last number to move. By the time your grocery bill goes up, a chain of cost increases has already worked its way through the entire system upstream. It starts at the farm, then it moves to processing, then to packaging, then to freight and logistics, and finally, it hits the distributor and lands on the shelf. At every single stage of that chain, costs have risen. And the critical point, the one that most people miss, is that these increases don't arrive at the shelf simultaneously. They stagger, which means the full impact of what happened to input costs in 2022 and 2023 has still not fully landed on American consumers. Some of it is still working its way through the pipeline right now. Let me give you specific numbers because this is where it gets real. The Producer Price Index for processed foods and feeds, which measures what it costs before the product reaches retail, has risen substantially above pre-pandemic baseline levels and has not fully normalized. At the same time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that food at home inflation, meaning what you pay at the grocery store, ran hot for over 24 consecutive months. Normally, when input costs rise and then ease slightly, retail prices follow down. That's not what happened this time. Retail food prices have remained elevated even as some commodity costs moderated. The reason is what economists call sticky pricing. Once retailers and suppliers adjust upward, they're extremely reluctant to move back down, especially when their own operating costs, labor, energy, freight, remain elevated. What this means practically is that there is no relief built into the forecast. You're not paying temporarily higher prices waiting for a correction. You're paying a new baseline. Now, let me talk about the freight piece, because this is the part of the story that almost nobody is covering properly. America's food system does not run on farms and factories. It runs on trucks. Roughly 70% of all food in the United States moves by road at some point in its journey from production to your table. And the trucking industry is in a complicated place right now. The American Trucking Association has documented a structural driver shortage that predates the pandemic and worsened significantly through it. The demographic reality is that the average age of an American truck driver is now in the mid-40s. The pipeline of younger drivers entering the industry has not kept pace with retirements. This is not a short-term problem. This is a workforce demographic issue that plays out over years, not quarters. Layer on top of that the fuel cost picture. Diesel prices are a direct input into every food delivery cost calculation. When diesel spikes, freight rates follow. Those freight rates are embedded in what grocery chains pay to their distributors and ultimately in what you pay at the register. The volatility in diesel since 2021 has made supply chain cost forecasting genuinely difficult for food companies. And when companies can't accurately forecast costs, they build in margin buffers, which means higher shelf prices even in periods when input costs are temporarily stable. Here's something I want to flag that I haven't seen anyone connect properly. If you look at the earnings calls from major grocery retailers over the last 6 quarters, and I've gone through several of them, you start to hear a consistent theme that isn't being reported on. These companies are talking about SKU rationalization. That's the industry term for reducing the number of individual products they carry. Fewer brands, fewer varieties, fewer options. The reason this matters is that SKU rationalization sounds like a business efficiency move, and on one level it is, but it also means that the grocery store is quietly absorbing supply chain stress by narrowing the selection. The shelf looks full, the square footage is the same, but the actual choice available to you has contracted. This is not speculation. It's documented in the operational language of the companies running the stores you shop in. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I want to know which parts of the country are feeling this the hardest, because the data shows this is not uniform. Certain regions, certain store formats, certain product categories are taking the hit disproportionately. Tell me what you're seeing locally. Now let's zoom out to something bigger, because the supply chain pressure is only one layer of this story. The second layer is the dollar and what's happening to the purchasing power of the income that American households are bringing home. Here's the uncomfortable math. Wage growth over the last 3 years has been real. The headline numbers are genuinely positive, but when you subtract food inflation from wage gains, the real purchasing power picture looks considerably worse. The Economic Policy Institute has tracked this. And what they've found is that for households in the bottom 2 income quintiles, meaning roughly 40% of American families, real purchasing power for food has declined even in periods when nominal wages were rising. That's not a media talking point. That's in the data. And it means that the food affordability crisis is not evenly distributed. It is concentrated in the households that can least absorb it. The dollar's global position adds another dimension that feeds directly back into domestic food prices. A significant portion of what Americans eat involves imported ingredients or products, everything from coffee and cocoa to certain grains and proteins, depending on domestic supply levels. When the dollar weakens against trade partner currencies, import costs rise. When import costs rise, domestic producers face less competitive pressure to hold prices down. This is a mechanism that most consumers never see, but it is a real and documented channel through which currency dynamics translate into what you pay for groceries. And the dollar has faced meaningful pressure over the last 18 months from a combination of deficit concerns, Federal Reserve policy uncertainty, and shifting global reserve currency dynamics that I've covered in previous videos on this channel. Let me be direct about something before we go further. I'm not here to tell you the grocery store is going to look like a war zone next month. That's not what the data shows, and I won't pretend otherwise. What the data does show is a system under compounding structural pressure, multiple simultaneous stressors that are each individually manageable, but collectively create a trajectory that is genuinely concerning over a 12 to 24-month horizon. The difference between understanding this now versus 6 months from now is the difference between having options and not having them. That's why this matters. Not panic, positioning. Let's talk about the concentration problem, because this is the part of the food system story that I think is most underreported and most important for understanding where the risk actually lives. America's food supply is not a distributed, resilient network. It is a highly concentrated system controlled by a surprisingly small number of companies. In beef processing, 4 companies control roughly 85% of the market. In pork, 4 companies control roughly 66%. In grocery retail, the top 4 chains account for the majority of food-at-home spending in most major metropolitan markets. This level of concentration means that when something goes wrong at one node, a processing plant shut down, a distribution center outage, a major supplier facing financial stress, the ripple effects move through the system fast and wide. We saw a preview of this dynamic during the pandemic when a handful of processing facility closures created genuine regional shortages almost overnight. The industry called it a temporary disruption. And technically it was, but what it revealed was how little redundancy exists in the system. There is no backup network sitting idle waiting to absorb shocks. The system runs lean by design because lean is profitable until it isn't. And the conditions that created those pandemic-era vulnerabilities have not been structurally addressed. The concentration has not decreased. In many segments, it has increased through consolidation that continued through the post-pandemic period. Now here's where I want to bring in something that hasn't gotten enough attention in the financial media. There is a documented divergence emerging between what government inflation data reports and what independent price tracking data shows at the shelf level. The consumer price index methodology involves substitution adjustments, meaning it accounts for consumers switching from more expensive items to cheaper ones as prices rise. From a macroeconomic measurement perspective, this is technically defensible. But from a household budget perspective, it masks the real cost impact. If you are buying choice grade beef and you switch to a cheaper cut because choice became unaffordable, the CPI records that as a kind of informal price adjustment. Your budget experienced it as a loss of purchasing power. These are not the same thing. And the gap between the official inflation measure and the lived economic reality of middle-income American households has been a growing source of tension that the data increasingly supports. I want to give you a specific example of how this plays out. Egg prices. The egg market in the United States has experienced extraordinary volatility over the last 2 years, driven primarily by avian influenza outbreaks that significantly reduced laying hen populations. At the peak, egg prices reached levels that were genuinely historic, not just elevated, but multi-decade record territory in some measures. The USDA reported on this. The price data is all public. What's interesting is what happened after. Prices moderated from the peak, and mainstream coverage declared the crisis over. But if you look at the longer time series, egg prices have not returned to pre-outbreak baselines. They've settled at a level significantly above where they were before. And a new outbreak cycle has begun that is already affecting supply again. This is a microcosm of the broader pattern. A shock arrives, prices spike, some moderation follows, but the new floor is higher than the old floor. Repeat this across enough categories and the cumulative effect on a household budget is substantial. Let me talk about the geographic dimension of this, because it matters enormously and it's almost never discussed in national coverage. Food insecurity and food price pressure in the United States are not distributed uniformly. They map closely onto existing patterns of economic inequality, and they are significantly more acute in rural areas and lower-income urban neighborhoods than national averages suggest. A household in a food desert, areas classified by the USDA as having limited access to affordable, nutritious food, faces a completely different economic reality than a household with easy access to a full-service grocery store. And the data shows that food desert geography has not meaningfully improved over the last decade despite various policy interventions. In some metropolitan areas, consolidation in grocery retail has actually reduced access as smaller stores closed and were not replaced. This is relevant to the supply chain story because the populations most vulnerable to food system stress are also the populations with the least financial buffer to absorb price increases or availability gaps. When the system comes under pressure, the impact is not evenly distributed. It concentrates in communities that were already on the edge of affordability. That's not a political statement. It's what the data shows. And for anyone watching this who is tracking these dynamics from an investment or portfolio perspective, it's also relevant to understanding where consumer spending compression is most likely to show up in earnings data. Now, let me bring this back to the macroeconomic picture, because the food inflation story connects directly to the Federal Reserve's policy challenge in a way that I think deserves more attention. The Fed's mandate is price stability and maximum employment. Food prices are a component of the inflation measures the Fed watches. But food inflation has proven to be stubbornly persistent in ways that monetary policy has limited ability to address. You cannot raise interest rates to fix a trucking driver shortage. You cannot tighten financial conditions to resolve avian influenza outbreaks. The supply-side drivers of food inflation are largely outside the Fed's toolkit. What the Fed can do is suppress demand broadly, and higher interest rates do reduce overall consumer spending, which can moderate inflation at the margin. But the risk is that you end up suppressing non-food spending in order to marginally cool food prices, while the underlying supply pressures remain unresolved. This is part of why the Fed's path forward on rate policy is genuinely complicated, and why food price dynamics deserve to be part of any serious analysis of where rates go from here. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. The food system pressures I've walked through in this video: supply chain structural stress, driver shortages, SKU rationalization, concentration risk, the gap between CPI and real purchasing power, geographic inequality in food access, and the supply-side inflation the Fed can't fix. None of these are independent events. They are interconnected dynamics operating simultaneously on the same system. And systems under multiple simultaneous stressors don't fail linearly. They can hold and hold and hold, and then move very fast. The early signals are in the data right now. The producer price index data, the freight cost data, the earnings call language from the companies running the supply chain, the USDA forecast revisions. These are the signals that institutional analysts look at before the story lands on the evening news. The reason I built recession warnings is exactly this: to go through primary data and institutional sources before the mainstream narrative catches up. By the time most people understand what's happening to food costs and food availability in this country, the window for preparation and positioning will already be narrowing. That window is open right now. And knowing it's open, while most people are still operating on the assumption that the system works fine because it has always worked fine, that's the entire advantage. The data doesn't lie. The question is just whether you're reading it. If this video gave you something the mainstream coverage isn't giving you, subscribe to Recession Warnings. Every video on this channel goes through the same process: primary data, institutional sources, honest analysis, no noise. The next video is going to cover something that connects directly to what we discussed today, and it's data that I genuinely haven't seen covered anywhere else yet. Don't miss it.